All right, welcome to the Jim Acosta Show, and it's another day that ends in Y and the chaos unleashed by Donald Trump in the Middle East. That is causing the price of gas to surge in the U.S. up between 50 cents to $1 a gallon, depending on where you live, since earlier this year. Meanwhile, Trump continues to lie about the war. Yesterday, he claimed Iran bombed its own school for girls, even though reports say that the school was hit with a U.S.-made Tomahawk missile, a weapon the Iranians do not possess. Let's discuss that and more with economist Paul Krugman, who has one of the best Substacks on the planet. He wrote about the oil issue today. Paul, good to see you. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Means I have to stop watching the price of Brent crude minute by minute while I'm talking to you. But anyway, there we are.
That's okay. We'll catch up when we're done. But
Yeah.
I mean, there's some other metrics to talk about. I mean, the AP just came out with this. 140 U.S. troops have been wounded in the Iran war, including 8 severely and 108 who returned to duty. That's in addition to the 7 as of this podcast recording service members who have died. And we were just talking about the price of gas. We can show this to the viewers. There's a, AAA. They monitor the average price of gas week to week. It's up at around $3.53 cents a gallon. And I was just going to the gas station right around the corner from my place, and the price of gas is up there too. It's up like 50 cents. If you pay cash, you can pay $3.94, but nobody does that, so it's like $4 a gallon. And a lot of people are seeing this around the country. And Paul, you wrote about this. This should come as no surprise to people that this is happening.
Yeah, I mean, this is. I mean, 20% of the world's oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz, and if you look at a map, that's this fairly narrow strait, which makes a long dogleg around the sort of tip of the Arabian Peninsula, with Iran on the other side, and it's completely crazy to have imagined that you could start a war there without putting all of that shipment. The oil doesn't do much good stuck in the Persian Gulf. It's 20% of the world's supply, and if we're going to keep on as appears, there's no sign that we're going to open that strait anyway anytime soon. That's a bigger oil shock than anything that happened in the 70s. I've been around a while. I remember the oil shocks of the 70s. I actually started working in energy economics in 1973, and this makes those look like relatively small disruptions. So, my God, what were they thinking? But obviously, they weren't thinking. But this is an amazing thing to be doing right now.
Yeah. I mean, I remember that too as a little kid waiting in line for gas with my parents. That's about as much as I could remember from all of that. And you write in your piece in Substack that, I mean, so much for drill, baby, drill. Donald
Yeah.
Trump made this pitch to people, to pitch to the voters that drill, baby, drill is just going to solve all of our energy problems. Not so much.
Yeah. I mean, the United States, we have drilled, or we fracked mostly rather than conventional drilling, and the United States is a net exporter of oil. It's a little bit complicated. We import some oil from Canada to the Midwest and a little bit from Mexico. Then we export a lot from Texas to the rest of the world. But overall, the U.S. is self-sufficient in oil, or more than self-sufficient. But that makes absolutely no difference, because oil is a global, it's a global commodity. A tanker can go from, it can be diverted to wherever the demand is highest. And so there are 2 sort of benchmark global prices. There's West Texas Intermediate, we can guess where that is, and there's Brent, which is in the North Sea. So there's a European price and a U.S. price, and they're always within a few dollars a barrel of each other. They track each other. So the fact that, the U.S. is a big oil producer, which means that rising oil prices are worth a lot of money to U.S. oil companies, but that doesn't do anything for you and me when we're filling up our tank at the pump. So the U.S. is very much exposed to all of this.
And Trump seemed to understand this yesterday, and he put out this storyline that perhaps we're close to the end of whatever he's doing right now. And we saw the stock market reacting very negatively to the price of oil going up pretty much throughout the day yesterday. And then when he made these comments, I guess first it was to CBS, and then he made it at a press conference, the stock market swung back in the positive direction. And I remember seeing this happen all the time when I covered him during the first administration. He really does pay attention to what's happening on the stock market, and he will do things one way or the other to juice things. So it's back in back in positive territory by the end of the day. I guess let's play a little bit of some sound from yesterday when Trump was talking about how this is an excursion and don't worry, it's all going to be over soon, and not to worry, folks, about gas prices and the economy and so on. If we have that.
Oh, well.
Well, do we have that bite? We might not have that bite. Sometimes it takes a second to play it, Paul. Well, while they're getting it ready, you saw that, Paul, yesterday. I mean, was this just blatant, market manipulation by Trump?
Yeah, it's an attempt to talk things up. He's trying to keep them. It's clear that despite all of his bravado about, I don't trust the polls and all that, he sees what's happening, and the market is spooking him as I think it's a lot more beyond the market that he should be worried about on that front. But where is the, I guess when Iraq, so you and I both remember Iraq very well. And at the beginning, the U.S. military people, our military people are pretty sophisticated, and they were saying, how does this end? Well, how does this end? I mean, my God. And it's not even as if, even if Trump really decides to admit that, de facto admit defeat, declare victory, and just stop, we have a new supreme leader in Iran, and we just killed his family. Yeah. They're people too. They're horrible people in this case. But the fact of the matter is that we have now created people who are still have, as far as we know, large numbers of cruise missiles, still have mines. So you're presumably not watching. No, I'm not watching the stock market, which does whatever it's going to do. I'm watching the oil market a lot right now, and it's swinging wildly hour by hour. There was a U.S. official posted a tweet claiming that the U.S. Navy had escorted an oil tanker through the strait, then deleted it because it never happened. But the market, price of oil plunged, then came soaring back, and just a little while before we went on, there are reports that the Iranians either have started or are getting ready to start laying mines, because apparently they have thousands of miles, and there's this fairly narrow strait. So, these events are moving stuff crazily, and in some longer term sense, we should not be allowing the world to be so dependent on this strait. But meanwhile, how about if you're going to start bombing people, think about that a little bit.
Yeah, no, and I think what you were referring to is the Energy Secretary put out a tweet that said that a tanker had been escorted by the U.S. through the strait. And the White House had to say at the press briefing during the day today that no, that did not actually occur. And I mean, Caroline Leavitt has been putting out all kinds of stuff, just like Donald Trump. She lies all the time. And the other day she was saying, well, don't worry about gas prices. We do have this out. She said, don't worry about gas prices because we're going to take out the Iranian regime. Let's play this.
Gas prices right now. This is a short-term disruption for the long-term gain of taking out the rogue Iranian terrorist regime and finally ending their restriction of the free flow of energy in the Middle East and in the Strait of Hormuz. And even with this short-term period throughout Operation Epic Fury, the president and his energy team are on the ball. They've announced
Paul, she says right there it's about we're going to take out the Iranian regime. So this is just a price we have to pay. But the Ayatollah's son is in charge now. As far as we can, go ahead.
No, I mean, regime change, as we learned in Iraq, is very difficult, even if you're willing to put boots on the ground and spend years and spend hundreds of billions of dollars to do it. And just bombing has never achieved regime change. It's possible that Trump took what happened in Venezuela. We didn't actually change the regime. We just basically killed the capo and had the vice capo take over. And throw some money in Trump's direction, but he may have thought that Iran was going to be like that, and it's not. It's a gang of thugs, but it's a gang of fanatically religious thugs who have got really deep roots in that country. And what do I'm talking out of my really beyond my expertise, but that was clear to everybody except apparently people running our country. And again, this is the energy, the risks here. The best you can say is that we are less dependent on oil than we were in the 1970s. So, oil is a a substantially smaller fraction of GDP, we're probably less prone to a runaway inflationary spiral than we were in the 1970s. But in terms of the magnitude of the threat that this war poses to the world's energy supplies, this is incredibly risky.
Yeah. Well, and there's also the unintended consequences. There was a story in the New York Times today saying that the Federal Reserve may decide to hold off on lowering interest rates sooner, or earlier, as early as this summer, because they're concerned about what might happen with inflation because of the price of gas going up. And there's also the other unintended consequence that Russia is benefiting from all of this because they get to sell more oil into the global market. I mean, so once again, we can't predict how these things are going to go.
Well, in a lot of ways, though, this was predictable. At least
Well, that's true.
this was a high probability set of bad events. I would have been shocked and surprised if, in fact, we quickly achieved regime change in Iran. If, in fact, there had been no disruption to oil supplies, this was sort of the most likely outcome. And the Fed it's interesting. I mean, in the 70s, there were two severe recessions following each. There was a 73 shock after the Yom Kippur War, and there was a 79 shock after the Iranian Revolution. Both of those were followed by severe recessions. And partly the recessions were directly because oil prices went up and people spending more money on gas can't spend money on other things. But to a large extent, they happened because there was this inflation shock and the Fed felt it had to raise interest rates to fight inflation. Now, maybe it's less of a shock this time around, but yeah, that's what it looks like here. The Fed normally tries to, as they say, look through oil prices. Oil prices go up, oil prices go down. Right. It's usually they don't want to react to it. But when the shock is this big, and there's one thing, I obviously know people at the Fed and have followed all these years. The one thing they're deathly afraid of is letting inflation get out of control. Right. Letting a short-term fluctuation, okay, but letting inflation get entrenched in the economy again, the way it was at the end of the 70s. That's the nightmare scenario. And so they will err on the side of not letting that happen, which means not cutting interest rates in the face of all of this.
Yeah. No, and we do have that excursion soundbite ready. The thing that I find and I shouldn't say it's funny because this is not funny what's happening right now. I mean, it's sort of sad in a ridiculous way, in the way that Trump is trying to tell people he's saying two things at the same time. He's saying, well, we might have to put boots on the ground. This may take 4 or 5 weeks. It could go longer. And then yesterday, he's saying that this could be over very soon, trying to buck up the markets. And he describes what's taking place now as an excursion. Let's listen to this.
Excursion, because we felt we had to do that to get rid of some evil. And I think you'll see it's going to be a short-term excursion.
And I mean, Paul, the other thing is he's making up rationales every day for why we're even doing this. About a week ago, he was saying, well, there would be a nuclear war happening in the Middle East if the U.S. had not gone after Iran. Yesterday, he was saying that, well, Iran was going to be striking targets in the Middle East. And he just fluctuates day to day as to what the rationale is. I remember, and we both remember what was taking place during the mid-2000s when the Bush administration was trying to sell the war in Iraq, and they were talking about weapons of mass destruction and so on. These aren't even, the lies that we're being told now aren't even like well-told lies. They're just badly told lies, poorly told lies.
Yeah, they're making it up on the fly, clearly. I mean, Iraq, there were reasons they wanted to invade Iraq, and then they settled on weapons of mass destruction as the story lies, the cover story. But at least they stuck to that. I mean, it's funny what you take, what looks like good practice now. It seemed like the worst thing ever back then, but now it's at least they had some good lies to tell. And this time around, it's just it's the swindler who tries a different swindle on you every 5 minutes. And really, I think this was the old phrase, a splendid little war, that they thought they could have a quick victory. Trump wanted his mission accomplished moment without being willing to even put in the amount of planning that George W. Bush did, and had no plan B if it didn't work out that way.
Yeah.
And my God, again, it just boggles the mind. And and I don't know how this ends now. I actually think that the oil markets, and even more the stock market, is leaping on every slight indication,
Right.
that we're going to end this. But I don't. I mean, there's actually, I would say there are two parties to this, but there's actually three. There's Trump. There's Netanyahu, because remember, this is actually a joint U.S.-Israeli thing, what excursion, I guess you'd call it.
Yeah.
And then there's the Iranian regime. And this doesn't end until all three decide to end it. And I don't quite, that looks to me like, one thing to actually add to this, I'm not sure that people know this. So we have all this oil that is bottled up inside the Persian Gulf because the strait is closed. What has started to happen is that they've been pumping oil in all of these countries all along, but they're out of storage. So the countries are all cutting production. And turning oil wells on and off is not like turning the tap in your shower, right? It's not like, I turn off the hot water and I'll turn it back on again. It is, the shutdowns will now take a long, long time to reverse. So this is now starting to seriously cut into the world's supply of oil, not just while the strait is closed, but for long after the strait is reopened. So all of that is just adding to this stress. And anyway, sure. I mean, what was really peculiar to me, by the way, was that when Trump did the State of the Union, he especially boasted about low gas prices.
Right.
And then just, a few days afterwards, I think like 4 days after the State of the Union, he goes ahead and starts something that immediately, of course, drives gas prices up. And they're about close to 60 cents a gallon higher than they were on the night he gave that speech.
Yeah. And I think I think we might have a tweet that the White House put out. I think this was back in January, bragging about where the price of gas was. This is what they tweeted January 12th of this year. Gas is the lowest average in nearly 5 years, $2.79 a gallon. Now we're at about $3.53. So we're almost a buck more. And Paul, you understand this all too well. It's the folks who put Trump back in the White House who are paying for this. I mean, who rely on gas-fueled automobiles, who rely on this kind of an economy. In all sorts of ways.
I have to say that part of the problem is that the United States has had low gas prices. If you've traveled in Europe, you have an idea that they have much, much higher taxes. And they've adapted to that. So people drive smaller, more fuel-efficient cars. Americans, and this is not a moral complaint, Americans drive relatively, gas-using, shouldn't say guzzling, gas-using cars because it made sense to, because gas has been cheap. So you suck people in with that, and then you hit them with a sudden increase. And it's a peculiar thing. The U.S. is a major oil producer. We are, and we do produce as much oil as we burn. You would think that would mean that we would be insulated as a nation from these events. But in fact, because the price of oil is the price of oil, regardless, even doesn't matter if there's a lot that's produced here, and because Americans we're especially dependent on automobiles, we drive bigger, more gas using, less gas efficient automobiles, we are actually hit worse by this crisis that the Trump administration has unleashed. Then we're hit worse than the Europeans, we're hit worse than the Chinese or the Japanese. It's an amazing thing. We have really done a self-inflicted wound by this war.
And what is the likelihood that we will hit a period of stagflation in this country?
Okay. If oil stays at its current price, probably not. I mean, the silver lining here, the good news in all of this is that we are, despite the best efforts of the drill baby drill people and all of that, the United States has become much, much more energy efficient over the years.
And that's a good thing. Yeah.
What?
And that's a good thing.
That's a good thing. No, we just made the U.S. The U.S. economy is almost 4 times as big as it was in 1973. U.S. oil consumption is about the same as it was in 1973. So we're, like a quarter as dependent on oil as we were then. So that does limit the damage. It would take oil prices of something like $150 a barrel to produce an energy shock like the ones we had in the 70s, an economic shock from energy. Now, of course, that is well within the realm of possibility. We can do it, America. We can do it, but
let's not.
Let's not. And then we're probably less stagflation sort of prone as a nation also than we were in the 70s. In the 70s, the oil shocks hit an economy which already had high inflation. And although Trump tries to pretend otherwise, inflation was pretty much under control when he took office. So things were not so bad. We're not hair trigger. We don't have a lot of inflation indexed contracts the way we did in the 70s, which caused this thing to spiral. Just generally, we just have a lot more sort of credibility inherited from a long period of pretty reasonable inflation performance. So that's an extra buffer. Now, everything can be overcome. If you make things bad enough for long enough, then none of that works. I'm actually more worried about just plain ordinary recession. I mean, we had a really lousy job report just a few days ago. Now that's probably statistical noise. It probably wasn't that bad. We probably didn't lose 90,000 jobs in February, but we probably didn't gain 120,000 in January. It's probably just the noise. But definitely, employment growth is kind of flatlining. Definitely, there are some real worries in the credit markets. This is an economy that you would say, this is not an economy we want to subject to another dose of bad news. And so that's where my biggest worry is actually not that it's going to turn into 1979 again, although again, we're giving it the old college try, but that more like it's going to be a little bit more like hopefully a minor version, but I'm more worried about 2008 than I'm about 1979.
Wow. Well, I mean, and arguably 2008 is a lot worse than 1979. I don't know, maybe because I was a kid, I don't remember it, but 2008 was devastating in terms of what it did to the long-term economic picture of this country. And a lot of people are still hurting after that financial crisis. But Paul Krugman, great to see you as always. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. We'll have to do this again soon. But when I saw the gas stuff going and I saw your Substack, I had to reach out. So thanks so much.
Okay, thanks a lot. Take care.
All right, you too. Good to see you, Paul. Thanks. It's always good to talk to an expert on these things, folks, because yours truly, I'm an expert on what I'm doing right now, just talking to you. That's what I'm an expert in. I mean, I'm being somewhat facetious and modest, but I'm not an expert on a whole lot. And it's interesting to hear what Paul Krugman is saying, that if gas prices continue in the direction that they're headed, we could be heading towards a very serious economic crisis in this country. That's why I wanted to bring this up and talk about it with him today. So really appreciate that conversation. A lot of other news happening. Somebody who is a friend of the show and is waiting in the wings, I'll bring her in now, is Liz Oyer, also known as AKA Oyer Lawyer. Or is it Lawyer Oyer? I do this every time. It's Lawyer Oyer, isn't it?
Lawyer Oyer. But either way, Jim, you can
it.
find me either way. You can call me whatever you want.
But we had scheduled to come on today, which is perfect. And then out of nowhere, there was an Ed Martin headline, which we should get into, because, with everything that's going on in the Middle East, it's easy to forget the turmoil that is happening here in Washington and how, there's just a mess over at the Justice Department these days. But it is good to know that there might be some consequences for the people who have engaged in these hijinks back here in Washington. And one of them is Ed Martin, who they tried to put up as U.S. Attorney for Washington, D.C. That didn't work out. He's been sort of leading the administration's weaponization task force, if you want to call it that, although he's been trying to do some weaponizing himself. And now I'm seeing a headline, Liz, that the D.C. bar is coming after Ed Martin for what he tried to do to Georgetown University or Georgetown Law School. What do you know about this? I think this is very interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting, Jim. Ed
Yeah.
Martin is someone who came from a very untraditional background as far as Justice Department officials are concerned. He made his name as a leader of the Stop the Steal movement. He
Hmm.
is a loud, vocal MAGA supporter who represented a number of the January 6 rioters. And Donald Trump initially put Ed Martin into a very important prosecuting role as U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia. And in that role, Martin decided to start opening investigations into issues of interest to him without any consideration of how the process actually is supposed to work. So he sent out a lot of letters. He just papered the universe with letters to all of the people that he, had some sort of interest in. And one of the letters he sent was to the dean of Georgetown Law School. And he told Georgetown Law School that it had come to his attention due to a whistleblower report that Georgetown was teaching and practicing DEI. Now, he never says in the letter what DEI means or why it's bad or why it's
It's
even
just a
in his
Fox News
purview.
trigger word,
Right.
right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly, Jim. So he references DEI, and then he goes on to say that his office, the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C., which employs hundreds of people, a very sought after employer for people coming out of law school in D.C., will no longer hire graduates of Georgetown Law School until essentially Ed Martin is permitted to rewrite their curriculum that they're teaching at the law school and
Wow.
ensure that it has no DEI included in it. So this was rather extraordinary, and very much to its credit, Georgetown Law School pushed back. The dean did not entertain this request from Ed Martin, but essentially wrote back and said, "What is your authority to do this? What are you talking about? What are you looking for here?" And Martin just doubled down. He refused to answer that question, to provide any more information about what he was looking for or what his legal authority was, and instead said, give me what I want or else. Perhaps unbeknownst to Martin at the time, this triggered an investigation by the DC bar, where Martin is licensed to practice law, into his conduct and the question of whether it violated any of his ethical obligations as a lawyer. And the DC Bar Disciplinary Council reached out to Martin to ask for Martin's input on these charges. And Martin took some additional extraordinary actions in response to the request from the disciplinary council. He tried to get the investigation shut down. He refused to engage with the disciplinary council, which you're actually required to do as a member of the bar. And instead, he tried to get the disciplinary council suspended from his job. This is a respected person who's been in this job for over a decade and been practicing law for probably about 50 years in DC. And Martin decided to try to get him suspended rather than participating in the process. And that didn't end well for Martin, because now it has been revealed that the disciplinary council has charged Martin with violating bar rules. He specifically has charged him with violating his oath and duty to uphold the Constitution, and also with essentially obstructing justice by refusing to participate in this proceeding and trying to go around the process instead. So those are incredibly serious charges for a high-ranking DOJ official to be facing, and Martin is really going to have no choice at this point but to respond to those charges. The court ultimately, now the DC Court of Appeals will have jurisdiction ultimately over this matter, and he could be suspended from the practice of law or lose his law license as potential consequences. But it is a very slow process, and it is not likely to be resolved anytime soon. It probably will take years to reach a conclusion.
Right. But I mean, it just underlines how outrageous it was, for somebody who was involved in the Stop the Steal movement to have been nominated to be the U.S. Attorney for Washington, D.C. to begin with, that he's even at the Justice Department now. He's at the Justice Department now, if I'm not mistaken. And the other thing that you called my attention to, Liz, we should talk about, is that the DOJ now wants to get its fingers into how state bars operate. So, I mean, this is one of the things that folks in the pro-democracy side of things have been talking about. Well, if lawyers working for Donald Trump are going to violate the law or do things that are, in violation of the Constitution, these state bar associations can, go after some of these folks and sort of teach them a lesson and send the message to others. Hey, this is not going to be tolerated. You can't be, a lawyer in good standing in a state or the District of Columbia if you're engaging in this sort of stuff. And now the DOJ wants to get involved in how state bars do this and discipline people in their jurisdictions? Do I have that right?
That's exactly right,
Yeah.
Jim. It's actually it's an issue that has not gotten a lot of attention, but it is incredibly important in terms of accountability. All lawyers are subject to a rules of professional ethics and professional responsibility, and the jurisdiction where you are licensed has the authority to enforce those rules against you. That is independent from the Department of Justice. So DOJ lawyers not only have to answer to DOJ's internal rules and policies, but also to the ethical obligations of these state bar associations. Pam Bondi has proposed a new federal regulation that would essentially allow her as Attorney General to intervene in the independent state bar proceedings and shut them down and allow
Wow.
DOJ to handle all of the discipline internally. Now, that even in the best of times would be a terrible idea, because the idea of an organization policing itself is not sound, but it's especially problematic in this administration because Pam Bondi has essentially removed all of the guardrails and enforcement mechanisms for ethics and professional responsibility inside the Justice Department. She has fired the director of ethics, so the senior career official responsible for enforcing ethics rules internally. She forced out the director of professional responsibility, who is the person responsible for overseeing and investigating complaints of misconduct internally within DOJ. And she has essentially removed any existing infrastructure to deal with those types of complaints internally. So really what she is trying to do is to remove DOJ officials from accountability 100%, which is very problematic given the fast and loose approach that this Justice Department is taking, where they seem to believe that accomplishing the president's political objectives gives them license to ignore and violate the ethical rules that apply to all practicing lawyers.
Right. I mean, it seems to me a code of ethics for attorneys is just gone completely out the window over at the Department of Justice.
Yeah.
I mean, just the other day, they hung a banner of Donald Trump over the Department of Justice. I thought that was absolutely appalling. And if I'm not mistaken, they also said recently that Donald Trump has been exonerated in the Epstein files, which how do they say that? I don't even understand how they say that. It seems to me Pam Bondi should be subject to some sort of bar investigation, state bar investigation, where she's no longer Attorney General, because the stuff that she has been doing to me flies in the face of what I would think a state, and I'm not an attorney, so I don't know. I'm just, this is like me watching Matlock. That's where I get my legal expertise from, Liz. But it seems to me that they would not want this at any state bar, what Pam Bondi's been up to.
Well, the reason that Pam Bondi has proposed this new rule is because there have been so many complaints filed with state bars against DOJ leadership, including Pam Bondi herself. Pam Bondi is barred in Florida, so the Florida bar has received numerous complaints against Bondi. And the position that the bar in Florida is taking is kind of a cop-out, you could call it. They have said that they cannot consider a complaint against a sitting cabinet official, so they will not entertain complaints against Pam Bondi while she is the Attorney General. And they have stated to all those who've submitted complaints that they will have to refile them after Bondi is no longer the Attorney General. So there will be no accountability for Pam Bondi from the Florida bar as long as she remains the Attorney General. There are other officials who are facing complaints in different jurisdictions, and those jurisdictions may handle the complaints differently. There is a former official, Lindsay Halligan, who was the subject of misconduct complaints in Florida as well. And initially, the Florida bar said that they had an investigation open against her. They then walked that back and said that they were just monitoring the situation. So it's unclear what's going on in Florida. And Pam Bondi is deeply connected to that legal community because she was the Attorney General there. So it's unclear what she may be doing behind the scenes to try to influence the course of those investigations that might be taking place in Florida.
Right. And Lindsay Halligan, of course, is the ringer that they put over there at the Eastern District of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Virginia to go after James Comey, the former FBI director. And so that's where we get Lindsay Halligan from. And I don't want to neglect to get to this story. This is something I've been following. Obviously, the twists and turns and the appalling actions that have been taken by ICE over the last several months. And of course, we've seen, just horrific stories involving ICE and its agents and the killings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy and so on. Now they're getting into, I guess, arresting journalists. And I wanted to ask you about this. Apparently, a federal judge has ordered the Department of Homeland Security to justify the detention of a Nashville, Tennessee journalist, this according to the Wall Street Journal, who was arrested by immigration officials last week. She's Colombian born. Her name is Stephanie Rodriguez Flores. She's 35 years old. She was arrested by immigration officials last Wednesday in the company of her U.S. citizen husband. This is according to legal filings. And she works for Nashville Noticias, which is a Spanish language online news outlet. And she's been very critical of ICE. She's been very critical of DHS. And it's just outrageous to me, Liz, that ICE is not only violating the constitutional rights of U.S. citizens, of people who are legally in this country as migrants, they're now going after journalists. And where does it stop?
Yeah, there are no limits being imposed by the Justice Department. Ordinarily, arresting a journalist would be subject to a heightened standard of scrutiny because of the First Amendment implications, the possibility of silencing the First Amendment rights of that person. But this Justice Department has shown no regard for the First Amendment. And in fact, they seem to be in certain cases intentionally targeting journalists because of what they're saying. They are not respecting the role of reporters. They're instead accusing reporters of being participants in illegal conduct that they are actually reporting on. And we've seen that over and over again. We saw what the Justice Department did in the case of Don Lemon, who was arrested when he was covering a protest. We saw what they did with a Washington Post reporter who had her home essentially raided and her devices seized. They seized her devices, which contained the names of over 1,000 confidential sources that had been reporting on what's happening inside the federal government. It does not seem that these are just accidental overlap. They are targeting people who are in positions where they can disseminate messages that this administration doesn't like. And it's something that in ordinary times would be subject to a high degree of scrutiny, but that is not how this Justice Department is operating.
Right. And I mean, they just need to let Stephanie out. I mean, it's absolutely appalling. And this is just me getting on my personal soapbox. One of the things that we've seen since the beginning of the Trump administration 2.0 and these mass deportation operations is that Spanish language journalists, which get, for those of us who are in the English speaking world and watch English speaking news and so on, we sort of don't understand what's happening in Spanish language television and Spanish language journalism. But there's some really terrific reporters who have been really, doing excellent work on ICE and what's been happening in this country. And this woman is Stephanie is just another example of that. And I just think that it's really, really appalling. And what's your sense of, because you and I haven't talked about ICE, Liz, could there be legal consequences for ICE agents, for people in charge of ICE down the road?
Well, Jim, courts have lost their patience with ICE repeatedly defying court orders and taking actions that are illegal, essentially, in regard to detaining people unlawfully, detaining people for too long, failing to release them when they're supposed to be released. A court in New Jersey recently found something like 60 violations of court orders in a period of just a couple of weeks. A court in Minnesota found over 100 violations in a similar period of time. And courts are starting to crack down. There have been contempt hearings where they are now threatening to hold DHS officials or DOJ lawyers in contempt of court for violating court orders. It is very clear across the country that courts have run out of patience. But as for additional consequences in terms of criminal prosecutions for some of these ICE officers that have really engaged in egregious violations of people's civil rights, that is something that remains to be seen. There's no indication that this Justice Department is going to do any serious investigations in that space. There could be investigations and accountability under a future administration in theory, but a major concern that I have is the possibility that Donald Trump could grant broad clemency to all of the ICE officials who have been carrying out his immigration mandate before he leaves office and prevent accountability for people like the officers who killed Renee Good and Alex Preddy.
Right. And that's why it's going to come down to whether state charges are allowed somehow in the future, whether they come to pass somehow in the future. But Liz Oyer, always great to talk to you. Wouldn't you know it, that an Ed Martin story would pop up on the same day that we're talking about this. Just outrageous that somebody involved in the attempt to overturn the 2020 election would even be employed by the U.S. Justice Department. And we'll have to keep following those twists and turns. But Liz, great to see you.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you very much. And I do want to get back to the breaking news about what is taking place in the Middle East. As the war against Iran continues, Donald Trump has been offering different rationales as to why the U.S. is even engaged in this war to begin with. He has been lying to reporters nonstop, as has the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt. Meanwhile, the American people are feeling the economic shockwaves. The price of gas has been soaring over the last several days. It's now at about $3.53 a gallon. That's about 70 cents higher than what it was just a couple of months ago. Let's talk about the economic consequences of all of this with the former Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo. Madam Secretary, great to see you. Thanks for coming on.
Yes, great to be with you. How you doing?
I'm doing great. And thanks so much for spending some time with us. I guess I do want to talk about, you have a really interesting op-ed in the New York Times today about artificial intelligence and how this is the next threat to the American economy. You say it doesn't have to be a threat, but I want to talk about that in just a moment. But with everything that's taking place in the Middle East right now, what's been your sense of things watching all of this unfold? And Trump, I mean, I've been calling it a war of choice. So have others. What he's decided to do here and how it's been affecting the American people and American business.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, Jim, there's no question that Iran is not our friend and, exists for the purpose of being against the U.S. That being said, it isn't at all clear to me what we're trying to accomplish in this war. Why? Of course, I wasn't privy to the intelligence, but he has still not articulated, what are we doing here? What does victory look like? How will we have a plan to make sure it doesn't go on forever? There's no natural ending point to a war, right? And, first it was supposed to be very short. Then he says it could be very long. It's not at all clear to me we've accomplished anything because the supreme leader's son is now in charge. So that's hardly regime change. And the great worry that I have is it expands to a much bigger, much longer regional conflict. It's not as if we mobilized our allies before going into this. It's not as if Congress and the American people support this. So we're in really treacherous territory. In terms of the U.S. economy and the average American, I mean, look, there's nothing good about it. Right. No. I mean, yourself, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know everything's expensive.
Right.
And the last thing people can afford or need is going to the gas pump and seeing prices go through the roof. By the way, not just consumers, small businesses. Right. If business, if you're a restaurant or any business, your prices are going to be going up. And we just did $1 trillion of cuts. I was back in Rhode Island recently, which is where I'm from, and I was reading the local paper. And Massachusetts, Rhode Island, they're getting ready for how they're going to deal with the Medicaid cuts, and they're brutal decisions, Jim. Brutal decisions. No more aid to people in hospice. Cutting services to the elderly. We can't afford to give Americans proper health care and dignity in older age, but yet we can afford to wage a war on our own with no apparent outcome that's, in sight. So it's not good. And then the economy, anyone will tell you uncertainty is what kills an economy. Rising prices will kill an economy. So there's no good news, unfortunately.
Right. I mean, it's been estimated that this is costing $1 billion a day. And I have to assume in Washington talk, when they tell us it's $1 billion a day, it's probably $1.5 billion. And so that's just the beginning of all of this. And I'm just, and of course, there's the story in the New York Times today that the Fed may hold off on interest rate cuts, which we've all been hoping for to help the housing market. Anybody who wants to buy a house these days, especially young people, they're going to have to hold off longer if they've been waiting for lower interest rates because of the worries about inflation precipitated by these spikes in gas prices. And so it just goes to the unintended consequences of all of this. I'm just curious, Madam Secretary, if you were at the Commerce Department these days, what would you do if the price of gas were to shoot up 70 cents in short order?
Here's the thing, Jim, there's no silver bullet.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there is no, you talk about a gas holiday, strategic reserves. You need to end the conflict, right? You need to end the conflict. If ships aren't moving and the tankers aren't moving, there's a shortage. If there's a shortage, it's basic supply and demand. And if there's a shortage, prices will go up. I would say even more than that, these huge spikes, it's the uncertainty and unpredictability. I was talking to a CEO today who was telling me that, business isn't bad, but with all this uncertainty, they're just going to hold back, not make the new investment in the facility, put a hold on capital expenditures, not do some hiring. And this is what I hear from everyone. It's 'cause, it stands to reason if you are uncertain what's going to happen, if there's unpredictability, if there's conflict, you just wait, you just hold. And that drags on the economy. Increased prices drag on the economy. Unpredictability, lack of investment drags on the economy. So we need to end the conflict. And we need to know what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
If you're spending $1 billion a day, but the American people are behind you, and it's an investment to make us safer and stronger, maybe you could get behind that.
Yeah. But Donald Trump changes his rationale day to day as to why the U.S. is even at war right now. You've been in cabinet meetings with President Biden. What's your sense of how Trump's been handling this? I mean, your thoughts on the way Donald Trump has taken this country to war?
It seems very chaotic. I want to be a little bit careful. I wasn't in the meetings. I didn't have the intelligence briefings, so I don't know. But just again, one day you hear it's going to end soon, our mission is accomplished. The next minute you hear it's going to go on until the mission is accomplished. But then when asked what is the mission, it's not clear. And of course, again, just going it alone, it doesn't seem like the right strategy. The thing I worry about is I believe this conflict will have a very long tail. In other words, let's say the conflict ends, tomorrow, hypothetically. What have we really accomplished? We've destabilized Iran. We've upset a lot of our other friends in that region who have been unwillingly drawn into this conflict. We've disrupted the global economy, and we haven't had any regime change. We've seen over and over again in Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, how many times do we have to learn this lesson?
Right.
In that part of the world, conflict doesn't always lead to a regime change and a stable government.
Exactly. And it seems to me, on the subject of unpredictability, how is the American worker being looked after in all of this? I mean, they're just having to face more uncertainty. Anybody who is connected to the economy that surrounds gas prices is now they're worried about how this is going to affect them. And I know you've been focused on this aspect of what the American worker is going to be facing over the next 5 to 10 years with the onset of artificial intelligence in our economy. And you wrote this very interesting op-ed in the New York Times, basically saying, and if I'm mischaracterizing it, please feel free to knock me over the head and say you're mischaracterizing it. But basically, that the American,
I would never knock you over the head.
but that people should not freak out about AI, and that there may be kind of a middle way to figure out how to use this and how to make it work. And we need to get into Anthropic and all of these other things too. But I guess let's start off just why did you decide to write this piece, and what are your thoughts on AI? Because there are a lot of people out there watching this show who are probably putting in the comments right now, oh no, I hate AI. It freaks me out.
Yes.
This is like the Terminator. It's the end of the world. But your thoughts?
I think that's a problem. I mean, look, when the average American hears AI, they get afraid. If you hear AI, most people don't think opportunity. People think, I'm afraid I'm going to lose my job. What are my kids going to do? I hear from my friends, paying all this money in college tuition. What will jobs will my kids do? And so we have, and by the way, if the American people are afraid, that's legitimate. And so we shouldn't pretend, don't worry, it'll be fine. That's what we did when our manufacturing jobs went to China. Don't worry, it'll be fine. Everyone will have a services job. That didn't work. And we're still paying for it 30 years later. I think instead, and then there's a lot of people who say, slow it down, stop the innovation, moratorium on data centers. I think that's a mistake. We want to innovate. We want to lead the world in innovation. So I think we have to say, okay, let's lead in AI. Let's get as fast as we can to an AI-powered economy where people will be healthier and will have different jobs and new jobs. But let's get serious and find some practical solutions to make sure that the bottom doesn't fall out from millions of Americans in the transition. So what does that mean? It means, putting some burden on companies to redeploy people, not just do mass layoffs. It means new kinds of training for people who are mid-career and making that available to them without cost or little cost. I think it means new social safety net for people as they get through the transition. So I was at some colleges yesterday giving a talk. I mean, does college really need to be 4 full years at tens of thousands of dollars a year? 40% of people who go don't graduate. A lot of people wind up with no degree, amount of debt, and not a job. So I think the answer is go forward with AI, but let's get ready so we bring everybody along.
And I mean, all of that sounds very reasonable, but I mean, there are people who don't want data centers in their community, and then they see headlines like the one involving Anthropic and the Pentagon, where I guess now Anthropic is suing the Pentagon because the Pentagon had gone after Anthropic and designated it as a supply chain risk, I think, or something along those lines. And Anthropic is now saying, hey, all we wanted to do was avoid having our technology used in warfare, which I think to a lot of Americans, this is a pretty rational, reasonable thing to say. What's been your take on all of this? Because a lot of people are very unnerved. When that story came out, a lot of people were like, whoa, this is going too fast. And I think it's part of the reason why people think AI, it's going too fast.
Yeah. This is unprecedented that the government would say an American company is this kind of threat. This is the sort of thing that, maybe a Chinese or Russian company would fall into this category with good reason, by the way. So this is unprecedented. And from how it seems, it really has nothing to do with Anthropic's technology. It has to do with the fact that the administration didn't get their own way, and it's the way they deal with it. Do what we want, or we'll punish you. That's the way it works. It's a vindictive administration. I think, what has made America's economy the best in the world for so long is rule of law. Yeah. Every company is treated the same and gets a fair shake. And if we start to say the rules are going to be applied differently to one company versus another, and we're going to use the rule of law to get vengeance on a particular company, that is not an American way, and that is not an open rule of law. So, yeah, I think it's very problematic.
Madam Secretary, appreciate the time very much. I know we're all going to be watching how the next few weeks go, but a lot of unsettled Americans right now about the state of the economy. But great to have your insights on this show, and hope we can do it again.
That would be great. Have a good evening.
All right. Thank you, Madam Secretary. Gina Raimondo. And I should mention a former governor of Rhode Island, too. So my EP, Matt, is a native of Rhode Island. And so we have to get the Rhode Island shout outs there. But appreciate her time very much. I don't want to let the hour go by and wrap up this show without saying what needs to be said about Donald Trump and the way he is lying to the American people about this war right now. And apparently at the White House briefing earlier today, Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, was asked whether Donald Trump is being straight with the American people when it comes to going to war against Iran right now. And it's good that the question was asked. Caroline Leavitt, of course, lied and said, oh, no, Donald Trump, he's been telling the truth the whole time about why we're going to war and what we're doing in the Middle East and what we're doing in Iran right now. Donald Trump always tells the truth. Is basically what Caroline Leavitt says when she lies every day at the White House press briefing. Bullshit, baloney. Donald Trump, and I talked about this with Paul Krugman earlier on in the show. Donald Trump and his lies about what's happening in the Middle East right now, they're not even good lies. They're not even well-told lies. They're just the ramblings of a bullshit artist. And Exhibit A, there are lots of exhibits here, but I think Exhibit A would be what Donald Trump had to say about what appears to be the U.S. Tomahawk missile strike on a girls' school in Iran. Trump was asked about this. Trump has been saying lately that, oh, maybe the Iranians bombed themselves, hit themselves with the Tomahawk missile. And let's play some of the sound because there's a reporter from the New York Times, Sean McReish, who pressed him on this.
Go ahead. Mr. President, you just suggested that Iran somehow got its hands on a Tomahawk and bombed its own elementary school on the first day of the war. But you're the only person in your government saying this. Even your defense secretary wouldn't say that when he was asked, standing over your shoulder on your plane on Saturday. Why are you the only person saying this?
Because I just don't know enough about it. I think it's something that I was told is under investigation. But Tomahawks are used by others, as you know. Numerous other nations have Tomahawks. They buy them from us. But I will certainly, whatever the report shows, I'm willing to live with that report.
Donald Trump basically admitting there he doesn't know what he's talking about, but bullshitting the American people into thinking that maybe Iran does have Tomahawk missiles. No. Ladies and gentlemen, Tomahawk missiles, they are American-made weapons. They are not owned by the Iranians. The Iranians do not have Tomahawk missiles. They did not go to eBay and pick up some Tomahawk missiles to bomb themselves. But that's what Donald Trump thinks. And that's what Donald Trump thinks that you'll buy, that you will buy this bullshit excuse that the Iranians bombed themselves with U.S.-made Tomahawk missiles. But he's been doing this since the beginning of this war. And, I just want to run through some of the things that he's been saying since the beginning of this war. He was asked, he's been asked repeatedly for his rationale as to why we're even in the Middle East launching this war right now. Apparently, the president said that he had to strike Iran because he believed that Iran was going to strike U.S. targets within 7 days. He was also saying that Iran was going to strike U.S. targets within 3 days. He's been going down that road and claiming that Iran was going to hit U.S. targets in the Middle East, and that's why we had to go to war against Iran. He also said, this was last week, Trump said there was going to be a nuclear war if the U.S. had not hit Iran. There have been the excuses coming from the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, that Israel was going to go to war with Iran and that it was expected that Iran would hit back and hit U.S. interests in the region. And that's why we had to go to war with Iran. Every day, folks, it's a new lie from this administration as to why we're at war in the Middle East, as to why we're at war with Iran. And none of it adds up. None of it makes any sense. It's all bullshit. And you have to understand, for the folks in MAGA world, and apparently Joe Rogan today was saying he feels betrayed by Donald Trump and all of this. Wake up, Joe Rogan. Wake up, MAGA. I mean, Joe Rogan doesn't have to worry about the price of gas right now, but people in MAGA do. And I just want to say that to me, when the price of gas goes up, and we were showing this earlier, the White House was bragging back in January that the price of gas was like $2.79 a gallon. It's now $3.53 a gallon. There's the White House tweet back in January. Promises made, promises kept. Gas prices are at their lowest average in nearly 5 years, $2.79 a gallon. Now the price of gas, according to AAA, is around $3.53 a gallon. Now, I know math genius, but that's about, 75 cents a gallon that it's more expensive right now at the pump. And to me, we need to come up with a name for it. When Joe Biden was in office, all these MAGA people would put these little Joe Biden stickers by the rising prices of this and the rising prices of that. We need to start putting little Donald Trump stickers at the gas pumps And I'm asking Americans to go do this, make little Donald Trump stickers and put them on the gas pumps that say, I did this because Donald Trump did this. He single-handedly is the reason why you are paying more for gas right now. People in MAGA need to understand this. Joe Rogan needs to his limo driver needs to understand this. I'm sorry, Joe Rogan and your limo driver, but your limo driver is going to have to pay more for gas because of your support for Donald Trump. And people in MAGA world need to understand this. You did this. You did this. You are the reason why we're all paying more for gas right now. And so to me, we should come up with a name for it. Should we call it the Trump tax? Should we call it the Lindsey Graham tax? I mean, I think just call it the MAGA tax. That's what we're paying right now. We're all paying the MAGA tax because Donald Trump, for reasons he has not explained, has decided to launch a war of choice in the Middle East. And we don't know how long it's going to last. Some days he says it'll be over in 4 to 5 weeks. But then when the gas prices go up and the stock market tanks, he says, oh, no, it's just about over. It's just about over. It's starting to remind me of the character from Saturday Night Live in the 90s. Yeah, that's the ticket, the pathological liar. That's Donald Trump. The pathological lying president. One subscriber says it's the Epstein tax. I like that one. Ooh, maybe we should go with the Epstein tax. Might need to go with the Epstein tax. We're workshopping this in real time, folks. I was going to say the MAGA tax. I like the subscriber comment. We're going to call it the Epstein tax. So, ladies and gentlemen, American people, ladies and gentlemen of the United States of America, you are right now paying 75 cents approximately more per gallon of gasoline every time you go to the gas station over what we had back in January, a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, because of Donald Trump trying to change the subject from the Epstein files. Because Donald Trump cannot handle the fact that we might talk about the Epstein files. He has launched a war in the Middle East, and now we're paying more for gas. Congratulations. Congratulations, MAGA. So there you have it. And I'm so glad that we came up with this all together as a group, folks. Think of this as one big Zoom call where we come up with what I think is very plain as the nose on our face, that the American economy, that the American worker, that the folks who are going to the gas pump each and every day, they are paying more money right now. They are paying an Epstein tax right now of higher gas prices because of Donald Trump's war of choice in the Middle East, a war of choice that is being sold right now to the American people with lies and bullshit. And every day, it's a new line of bullshit from Donald Trump as to why we're even doing this in the first place. And he needs to be called out for it. And it needs to happen by our news outlets. New York Times, Washington Post, Associated Press, Reuters, Wall Street Journal, CNN, MS Now, Fox. Well, they're not going to do it. I want you guys to get on this and start calling out Donald Trump for his lies. We did it in the 2000s. When George W. Bush was bullshitting the American people and lying to the American people about why we went to war in Iraq, Dick Cheney and all of them lying to the American people about why we went to the war in Iraq, that same thing needs to happen now because Donald Trump each and every day is selling you a line of bullshit about why we are at war with Iran right now, why you're paying more for gas right now. It's being sold to you by the bullshitter in chief, Donald J. Trump. My thanks to Gina Raimondo, the former Commerce Secretary, for joining me on the show today. My thanks to Liz Oyer, and of course, to Paul Krugman for his excellent thoughts on what we're dealing with right now in the economy. I don't say it often enough. I'll say it here again. Please subscribe, like, share, help support this program, support independent media. When you do that, it matters. It helps bring stories like this to you each and every day. Not everybody else is going to call it out like us, folks. And that's not a humble brag here. That's just stating the facts. They don't call it out. We will. That's my promise to you. Still reporting from Washington, I'm Jim Acosta. I'll see you next time.